Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Cope, and on behalf of the entire RTI Innovation Advisors team, let me say welcome to our webinar today on facilitating virtual collaboration sessions. First, I want to say that you are primarily in my thoughts. I hope that you and your loved ones are doing well, staying healthy, and will remain so through the duration of this pandemic that we're experiencing. Today, we're getting together to share with you our recommendations on best practices for facilitating virtual events and doing those with the intent for collaboration and engagement. This is one of many activities that we're undertaking as ways to help you, our clients, our friends, our followers, to adjust to this new way of working, this new work environment in which we find ourselves. So I hope that you find the session today to be highly useful for you. Let me set a little bit of context for why we're getting together and why this is such an important topic. It's amazing to think about how literally organizations all over the world are grappling with simultaneous issues related to the pandemic, both at strategic and tactical levels. At strategic levels, our executives and leaders of all kinds of organizations are grappling with business continuity issues, business resiliency issues, resource allocation, priority allocation, reviewing strategic plans and questioning why didn't those plans prepare us adequately for what we're experiencing. All of that creates a lot of churn and a lot of change within an organization. And that change is being directed downward and throughout the organization to the workforce in that organization who's being asked to implement these changes on top of simultaneously learning how to work in a remote environment. This is not an easy ask. This is not an easy time for anyone who's new to all of this change and is struggling to figure out how to move from physical engagement to virtual engagement. As our name implies, as RTI Innovation Advisors, clearly innovation is an important topic. It's one that we hold near and dear to us. And it's one that, we're of a belief that innovation is a hugely important mechanism within an organization, that it can influence very positive outcomes in new products, new services, new ways of working, new ways of engaging with customers and ecosystems. And if now isn't an important time for innovation, then when is? This is we don't want to see innovation slow down or be minimized because of all the changes that we're experiencing. It needs to flourish. It needs to be moving strongly now. We believe that it can. And with the tools that we're going to share with you today, the tools and the techniques that you're going to learn about today, and the ones that we've covered in previous webinars, innovation can flourish. You can continue to move forward with your teams and conduct highly engaging activities, collaborative activities, and keep the ball moving forward. That's our hope for you and your teams today and going forward. Let me say a quick word about our group. You may not be familiar with our team. So, quick introduction to our work that takes place at RTI Innovation Advisors. We are a mission-driven innovation consultancy, and our work is aimed at helping organizations maximize the impact that innovation can have within their organization and downstream of that organization to their customers and their customers and their customers. And we do that work in three various ways, three interrelated ways. The first, if you're following me on the chart that you see there at the top right, our strategic work is focused on helping organizations discern complex futures. We help strengthen and improve strategic planning processes by integrating new and innovative methodologies that we've learned about and experienced through future forward and futurist kinds of activities, so that the outcomes, the strategic plans, are more robust and able to discern more complex and longer horizon kind of timeframes. At a tactical level, a couple ways that we work, moving on around the chart to exploring innovation insights. Our insights work is aimed at helping innovation and new product development teams learn from the outside in, and we bring to those teams the world of the possible in terms of emerging technologies, new growth opportunities, new potential partners to align with so that innovation can flourish. And then our go-to-market work, we help organizations who are creating the very early stage technologies, the most nascent technologies, find that right path to the marketplace, bring the right partners together so that those technologies can realize the full impact that they were intended for. This is a quick glimpse into what we do. I'll close by saying, in this disruptive time we're all facing, we're here for you. If there's anything that we can do to be helpful to you following on this webinar, or if there's other topics that you're struggling with, you and your teams, we want to provide as much support and help as we can. So do not hesitate to reach out to us and let us know how we can be of assistance. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Carrie Strickland, our host for today's webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everyone. I'm Carrie Strickland from the Innovation Advisors team, and as Jeff said, I'll be your host for today's webinar. So we'll spend roughly the first half of our time together today in webinar presentation mode as I share some of our practices for virtual collaboration. And then after that, I'll facilitate a bit of a roundtable discussion with my colleagues Jim and Laura, who have been gracious enough to share their time and thoughts with us today. So as Jeff mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis has brought some new challenges for all of us. We would like to know about the challenges that are facing you, the things that brought you to the webinar today. So please take a couple moments to share your thoughts via the chat. Let us know what you're thinking about, why you decided to join us today. We're glad that you're here. We want to understand what things you're facing so that we can address those as we go through the content today. So perhaps you joined today because you're wondering how to keep your innovation team moving forward while everyone's working remotely. Or maybe you had an in-person collaboration session already scheduled. Now that has to be done virtually, and you're having to adjust to that. Maybe you're looking for ways to make sure your upcoming virtual session that you've got on the books is going to be engaging and going to be effective, and you're going to get the input that you need through that session. Just glancing over at the chat to see what some folks are dealing with. Yeah, Beth is thinking about some of the technology issues and internet interruptions that come with virtual meetings. We sympathize with you. The appearance of Cameron's dogs early will probably not be the last dogs that we hear in our time together today. My dog, I'm sure, will pipe up too. We'll just hope that the internet holds out. Other folks who want to know about how to engage the audience well. Other folks who are having to convert to a virtual platform for all meetings and information and learning sessions. Yeah, that's a big challenge. Yeah, and then transitioning planned in-person strategic planning sessions in particular to a virtual format. I think that one's particularly challenging because of the collaboration and alignment that's required. So we'll touch on some of those things as we can as we go through the session today. So this session is all about event facilitation, but that's what happens during the collaboration session, right? But good event design, good event planning, that's equally as important. I don't want to skip over or diminish that. If you weren't able to join our first webinar in this series that covered event design and planning, particularly for virtual events, we encourage you to check out the recording on demand. We'll include a link to that webinar with the materials that we'll send to you after the session today. So in that last webinar where we spoke about event design and planning, my colleague Jim, who's with us today, and you'll hear from him in the last half of today's session, he outlined our recipe for successful virtual collaborations. So He spoke about the principles of good event design, highlighted what things you should consider when planning a virtual engagement, and demonstrated some tools that you can incorporate into your virtual collaboration event plans. Today's focus is on virtual facilitation and execution. So our objective is to open your eyes to the different skills and considerations that come along with virtual event facilitation, regardless of the specific tools or particular activities that you need to undertake. So our hope is that you leave this session with a broader view of what it means to be the facilitator of a virtual session, and that you feel better prepared to enter into your next facilitation experience. Personally, I hope this also helps us all remember to extend some empathy and grace to our facilitators when we're in the position of serving as participants, which we all are from time to time. I think all of us could use some patience and some grace as we adjust to these new ways of working. So at this time, I'd like to ask a poll question to get a sense for our audience today. You should see the poll come up on your screen shortly. We'll give you just a moment to enter your answers. The question is, what types of virtual collaborations are you facilitating? Internal meetings, mostly with your colleagues, external discussions with clients or partners, or both? Great. It looks like most folks have weighed in. Cameron, if you want to share out the results there. So it looks like most folks on the line are having to do a bit of both, which is not surprising, right? We do too. Yesterday I had an internal session for our team to facilitate, and then today I'm here with all of you with an external audience, spending some time. So we understand that there's some different considerations that go into both of those things. We'll try to touch on that as we go through the rest of the content today. So why is skills facilitation so important for virtual collaboration events? We know that team culture plays a really important role in successful collaboration. Edgar Schein, formerly of MIT, defines culture as the ways of working together towards common goals that have been followed so frequently and successfully that people don't even think about trying to do things another way. So more succinctly, team culture, it's the patterns and behaviors we use to resolve conflict and make decisions collaboratively. When we're children, our culture of play is formed. This happens through the positive and negative interactions that we have with others on the playground. And it happens through explicit direction from our parents and our teachers. We learn the norms and behaviors that form the culture of play as we go. The challenge is that when it comes to virtual collaboration, especially right now, many of us are back to entering the playground for the first time. And as we have more and more virtual interactions, our team culture will form over time. And as facilitators, we have an important role to play in shaping that culture as it forms. Of course, the facilitator influences the team culture, but ultimately how the team interacts is up to the participants. This is especially true for those of you who are leaders. Your teams will notice and model your behavior. So staying attentive, signaling your engagement, whether that's visually in the chat function or visually with your body language, all of that matters. Also, trust your facilitator. Be willing to try new things. Be patient with yourself and your teammates as your teams form their new virtual collaboration culture. our team has published and put together this resource on facilitating at the front end of innovation that my colleague Jim authored. And in it, he outlined 6 aspects of what we call the facilitator's mindset. So this serves as a reminder that as the facilitator, we are in the session to enable the participants, keep them oriented towards the session objectives. And we should also set the example for the attitude and the energy that we want from the participants and help them face and work through disagreements openly. So there are 3 main parts to the journey of the facilitator: plan the event, facilitate the session, and follow up. Right? The best facilitators give just as much thought to the journey of their participants. What did they experience from the time they received the meeting invite and pre-work through to the time they move off to complete their action items? Now, the core work of facilitation happens in the middle 3 steps of the participant's journey: greeting participants as they enter the virtual space, engaging them in collaboration, and helping them exit with purpose and intent to go have impact. And so that's the focus of our session today. The facilitator has a role to play in each step. We'll talk first about the facilitator's activities during the enter step. So as folks log in, the facilitator is the gatekeeper. If you're the facilitator, you need to worry about security so your participants can relax and trust each other. It's your job to know who's supposed to be on the line, who's not, and whose random phone number that is in the list of participants. You should greet participants by name as they join and welcome them. This is especially important if your participants don't know each other well already. You should use a randomized meeting ID, passwords, a waiting room feature, whatever security features are provided in your platform to prevent unauthorized entry. Many of us have read about Zoom bombing at this point, where people randomly enter Zoom meetings to share offensive content. Some of you may have even experienced that already. I hope not. That can really derail the team culture and trust right off the bat. So you want to take all the precautions you can, but without setting up hurdles that make it difficult for the participants to enter and engage. If you hear someone join midway through the call, pause, stop the discussion, make sure you and everyone else knows who has joined. I think participants sometimes feel awkward about stopping what they're saying to ask, who was that who just rang in? I think people worry that they're going to feel like that their colleagues are going to feel like they're being questioned, or they're not trusted because the question was asked. So it's the facilitator's job to be bad cop a little bit there and stop the discussion and ask who's joined. So another word about trust while we're on that topic, a quote from Stephen Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. In a high trust relationship, you can say the wrong thing and people will still get your meaning. But in a low trust relationship, you can be very measured, even precise, and they'll still misinterpret you. Participation in virtual collaboration requires people to try new things, such as new ways of capturing information. When we're at least on video and maybe being recorded, and that puts us way out of our comfort zone. If the people in a virtual team don't trust each other, it will be harder for them to work together successfully. As the facilitator, you should consider how much trust exists among your participants and how much do you need them to trust each other. If you have many participants who don't know each other, but they're just working together for one single 1 or 2 hour session, you can probably build the basic amount of trust you need via some quick warm-up exercises. On the other hand, if you're facilitating a team that knows each other well, they may already have a high level of trust that enables you to move quickly, or a low level of trust that requires you to build in extra steps, more transparency, or be more forceful as a facilitator. When we facilitate a virtual session, setting guardrails is one way we help set norms for the interaction right from the start. I thought about the guardrails I have used and seen others use, and they fall into 3 general categories. So I'd like to invite you to add your favorite guardrails, the ones that you use frequently, into the chat box as we go along here. So some guardrails are expectations, such as stay engaged and participate in each activity. That's something that I, the facilitator, expect you, the participant, to do. Others we convey as requests, like close email and chat programs so that you can focus. I would really like it if you did that. It's not quite an expectation. I know that you might not, but I'm going to ask that you do. And lastly, some guardrails are permissions, such as take a break when you need to. Obviously, that's the kind of guardrail that might or might not be appropriate to any given session. The guardrails are always, highly tailored each time to the people in the room and to the session objectives. So I'm going to take a look over at the chat. Yeah, do not speak over others. That's important in the virtual environment, right? It's harder to hit that conversation flow. Take a stretch break if you need to. That's a good one. Be here while you are here. I like that. That's nice. It's got good symmetry to it. Confirm when you're done speaking. Over to minimize folks talking over each other. So make it clear when you have finished your thought. I like that. I like that. Control collaboration with the breakout room. Yeah, that's good. Manage introductions. Yeah, if you're going to ask people to introduce themselves, give some guidance about what you want them to say, right? Otherwise, you might get long introductions. Great, that's all good. So what next? Just like our weightlifter here who's chalking up his hands to get ready, you should facilitate a warm-up activity for your team. Warm-up activities have 3 main goals. They're an opportunity to introduce individuals or groups to each other, to get people familiar with the mechanics of the platform or the tools that they're going to use to collaborate virtually, and to set the tone for the teamwork that's to come. In choosing your warm-up activity, consider how many people you have and how complex the interactions you're asking them to undertake will be. Will they only be asked to do some simple voting, like our poll question that we had earlier? That's pretty easy. You probably don't need to do a lot of warm-up for people to understand how to do that. Or will they be, say, placing and arranging virtual cards in an online whiteboard platform like Mural, or drawing out their ideas, maybe either at their desk or drawing them in a virtual platform? If you only have a few people and you just need them to accomplish some simple interactions, I suggest you choose something fun, like ask people what they had for breakfast or for lunch that day, something that gets all the voices in the room and gets people talking. If you have more people, choose a warm-up that's quick, such as asking people to place their names on a map, marking their location, and share what they like about that place. As interactions get more complex, consider a warm-up that lets people practice what they'll then be asked to do, but practice on a low-risk topic, like pet animal names. If you are going to ask your participants to draw, choose something like the classic draw how to make toast warm-up that you might do virtually and create a chance for people to learn to use a virtual platform, or you might ask people to do individually at their desk, and that makes sure that everybody has the paper and the pens they need, within quick arm's reach. The more people you have, warm-ups for complex interactions become more difficult. So really give some good thought to using breakout groups for the warm-up if you have a lot of people and complex things to do. So now let's talk about what happens in the engage step. So within the virtual collaboration team, the main roles are the convener, that's the key stakeholder who sets the meeting objectives, and the participants. The facilitator, who designs and delivers the session, the scribe, who organizes and captures information, and the tech support people who arrange and manage meeting logistics may or may not be a part of the core team. Whenever it's practical to do so, we encourage separating the roles of convener and participant from the roles of facilitator, scribe, and tech support. The more complex the meeting or high risk the topic, the more important this becomes. When a team I was leading needed to have a virtual collaboration session to align on a new communications role that we were going to add to the team, I asked a colleague to facilitate so that I could focus on listening to what my team members had to say. And since none of the participants had to think about the facilitation tasks, they could focus all their attention on envisioning what they wanted to achieve with this new communications role. When we host more complex meetings with a large number of participants, like this webinar, we rely on RTI's tech support team, like Cameron, who's moderating for us today, to help cover the logistics and troubleshooting. So participants are there to join in the core activities of that workshop. Your role as facilitator is to help make sure they're engaged and effective while they do it. In general, you can expect somewhere between 10 to maybe 30 minutes of attention from your participants on a given activity before you need to give them something fresh to do. Also, if your session includes presentations on context or work completed since the last meeting, remember that you're not there for the presentations or to hear the content, no matter how interesting they might be. Your focus should be on the participants to watch for signals of engagement. So we've all participated in a virtual call where it sounds like someone is in the middle of this marching band that you see here, right? As facilitator, you should have the participant list up and open so you can see whose line is generating background noise and mute them if it becomes distracting. You can always unmute them when they need to chime in. Also, we all have a tendency to speak longer when we're by ourselves at our computer. This can extend the presentation part of a workshop and take up too much time. I was facilitating a short virtual session a couple weeks ago, and my facilitators ran over, reducing our brainstorming time. If I had been in the room, I would catch their eye or I would stand up and approach the podium, but I couldn't do any of that virtually. So that this doesn't happen to you, I suggest you have some pre-established line of communication between the presenters and facilitator so that you can signal them to speed up or slow down as you need to. And to prevent participants from having to interrupt to ask questions, encourage them to use a raise hand function if there's one built into the platform, or submit questions via the chat so that you can recognize them at the next logical discussion point. When facilitating virtual sessions, it's harder to correct and redirect participants if you start to see people completing an activity but not in the way you planned. This means it's especially important as a facilitator to give your brain a loudspeaker, communicate about everything you're thinking. Remember that some people will better understand by reading and others by listening. So in addition to giving verbal instructions, have the basic steps pre-written on the template you're collaborating in. Don't assume the participants understand what you're asking them to do. Be explicit in your instructions and demonstrate what you'd like them to do whenever you can. So for example, if you want them to capture ideas in individual rows in one column of a spreadsheet, demonstrate the first few rows yourself with some example ideas before you set them loose. Now, a word about constraints. Constraints help us be concise and keep moving. Time boundaries are just as important virtually as they are in person, but facilitators need to build in extra flexibility. For example, if you would set 5 minutes of individual working time to capture challenges around the topics during an in-person session, plan a few extra minutes, say 10 instead of 5, in your virtual session in case there are struggles with the technology platform or connectivity issues. Use a timer that's visible to the participants if possible. Warn them about 30 seconds to a minute before you end an activity so they can capture any final thoughts. You can also use your information capture template to signal boundaries. Pre-populating a certain number of boxes, rows, cards for participants to capture information in will help them understand whether to shoot for 2 ideas or 10. This will also help you gauge how close you are to completion and ensure you have the right amount of information to carry into the next activity in the workshop. So lastly, let's talk about the role that the facilitator plays at the end of the session. If you've ever tried to learn to play golf, you'll find out that the follow-through, the actions that happen after the club makes contact with the ball, are a critical part of having a good swing. The same thing is true when facilitating virtual collaboration engagements. Your job as facilitator doesn't stop once the workshop activities are completed. You need to finish strong in order to enable the team to have real impact. Even the best, most engaging collaboration sessions won't generate impact unless the follow-up actions are clear. We suggest thinking of follow-up actions across 3 time horizons: 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. If you can, suggest that individuals take on particular action items that you think may resonate with them based on the discussion. People who are engaged with a particular idea are much more likely to complete their actions on time. You can also offer to send individual reminders in a few days or a week to people who would appreciate that. And lastly, make sure you share out the action items quickly after the session while the discussion is still fresh for everyone. After the virtual collaboration engagement itself is complete, the facilitator has one more job to do. That's summarize and share the output of the session. Don't forget that the participants trusted you to enter their space and be a part of their discussion, so make sure to thank them. Summarize the session outputs with notes about the attendees, what was discussed, and capture the content generated, especially if it was generated in a cloud-based platform. Make sure you capture that, save that down in some way so that it can be shared across the team and accessed by all. So now we're going to move to the roundtable portion of our webinar. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and if Cameron, you can focus in on the video for Laura, Jim, and I would appreciate that. So at this time, I'd like to say welcome to my colleagues, Laura Martin and Jim Redden. I have 1 or 2 questions prepared for them that I'd like to start with, and we'll work in some questions from you all, the webinar attendees, as we go. So please submit questions that you'd like us to address through the Q&A or the chat function. I noticed as going through the other content, there's been a lot of discussion in the chat function already. That's great. So I look forward to keeping that going. So first, let's start with some brief introductions. Laura, would you say hello first?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Martin. I'm a senior director at RTI. I lead our global talent development function, which puts me right smack in the middle of doing a lot of facilitation. We facilitate learning for leaders. We also facilitate change management conversations, brainstorming sessions that might be a one-off or a sequence. And like many of you, one of our challenges that we've faced and have started to solve is, what do you do when everything was scheduled to be in person? And how do you make that transition into the virtual space with the same level of engagement, the same level of collaboration and participation as you had when you were in the live space? And so I will be chatting about that, how we do that as a facilitator, how do we create that culture of virtual participation, so that things feel as productive and as effective as I did in the real world when we were in person.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Jim.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Redden. I, like Carrie and Jeff, I'm part of RTI's Innovation Advisors team. I primarily focus on a lot of our strategic planning, front-end, horizon thinking kinds of work within the group. As such, I end up facilitating a lot of strategic planning sessions, long-range thinking kinds of things, and have, like Laura, started to adapt all the things we used to do in person into a virtual space and started to work through the challenges that kind of presents.
Great, thank you. So first, let's start with one or two of the questions that I have prepared. Laura, I would like you to, and invite you to weigh in a bit on this question. Tell us about some of the things that you do as a facilitator to help create and set up a virtual space that really encourages the authentic and productive dialogue that's needed for successful collaboration.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think about how do I really set that culture so that people are ready to engage. And I think so many of us focus on what does it look like when we're in the virtual room. And like you mentioned in your presentation, there's all the work before I get to the virtual room. The one big fallacy is that I can just take the deck that I had for the live session and just plop that into a Zoom meeting and just click through. And I promise you, if you do that, it's going to be probably not great, maybe even a disaster. So part of the work is really thinking about how do I prepare to be virtual? How do I think about the people that are going to be in that space? What do I know about them? Are there people who need more processing time? Do I want to share some of the questions that I'm going to ask before I get to the meeting itself? Do I have people who talk too much? How do I make sure that I help rein them in that virtual space? Like you mentioned, Carrie, we end up talking way longer when we're all by yourself, right? There's no restrictions. They're not as obvious. There's not someone fidgeting in the corner next to us because we've talked too long. I really also think about how do I intentionally build trust? And I do this really actively. So when I think about planning and designing the session, and then as a facilitator, how do I facilitate it? I think about how am I breeding familiarity? If it's a room full of strangers, what is that icebreaker? What am I really asking them to do? If I'm going to do brainstorming and I want maximum creativity, there's this really interesting research study out of University of Texas, Austin, that says if we ask people to share something funny, or even self-deprecating, we get 26% more creativity in that conversation versus if we ask people just to share rote information about the project. We end up getting less information, and in fact, people end up not discussing anything at all. So I'm really focusing on how to build familiarity. What we also know about trust and creating that space is that people want to know, are you credible? So as a facilitator, I'm inviting participants to share, what do they know? What is their expertise? Where is their voice most valued? And then if I think about the longitudinal process of building a culture of virtual sessions and virtual sharing, it's how am I going to be reliable in that? If I set these norms up front that I want everyone to share, that I'm going to ask the people who are quieter to pitch in, how do I keep that going? And sometimes that means I will ask some of our participants, we see who's registered, right? We see who's logged in. Hey, Alnisa, can you share blah, 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 since I see her online? Or, hey, other participant, I haven't heard much from you. What's your thoughts on this? Please share. I do that really actively and with intention. So I'm keeping track of who's saying what. And those are just some of my hacks for virtual facilitation, but it does really start with rethinking what we're going to do in the space and really thinking through engagement. And the one other thing I'd offer is getting really clear on your visuals. So there is nothing less inspiring than looking at a screen that's really boring or that's a lot of words, right? If it's a ton of words, no one's listening to what I'm saying as a facilitator or listening to the convener or the presenter. They're reading the words. We can't do both. We can either read the words or we can listen. So how do I bring an imagery that is interesting and is connecting to the words that the presenter or facilitator that I'm saying? How do I make sure that it's inclusive so there's lots of diversity on the screen? And how do I also make sure that if I'm using a metaphor, that I'm building it? So it's not just a final slide, but maybe I've built the slide or I've built the mural, or I've made the whiteboard ahead of time. So it's built and layered really nicely, and no one's watching me fumble through that. Those are just some of my tips. Thanks for the question.
Great. Yeah. I wonder if we might stay on that theme of trust a little bit. I've seen at least one or two questions pop in kind of on that topic of how to establish and then maintain trust within a team. One of the other things that comes to mind for me is that sometimes trust is about transparency, right? We don't trust when things aren't transparent. So as facilitator, you or the convener of the session needs to be transparent with the participants about what will happen with the information that's collected in that session, right? If you're asking people to give, to talk about challenges they face or to give you ideas, you need to tell them what's going to happen with that information. Jim, other thoughts about building trust or maintaining it from session to session?
I love in the chat window that some of these questions are coming back around this topic of trust. And believe me, I think that as a facilitator, if you're asking the question before you're in the room about how you're building trust with participants, you're like halfway there, because a lot of people don't even think to ask that question during the planning process. And so just by coming up with an answer to the question, I think you're one or two steps ahead of some other folks. I really think a lot of virtual facilitation is very much context dependent. And when I think of the various contexts that we encounter, certainly here, I'm going to shift away from like presentation and kind of one-way information flow and focus more on situations where you're facilitating collective engagement and dialogue, where really you need that participation from multiple folks. And a lot of those nuances come down to how many times are we getting together? Is this a group of 5 people that's going to meet 5 times in the next month? Or is this a group of 100 people who are going to meet once a quarter for the next year, right? And each of those situations have some nuances with how you go about building, establishing trust, what kind of warm-up activities are important, and really how you go about planning the engagement of that session as a whole. Another question I saw here that I'll address really quickly: how do you eliminate those technology obstacles for participants? I find it kind of critical as facilitator to make sure that participants have the opportunity to engage with the platform ahead of that go live feature for my collaboration session. So if I want them to use Zoom, I make sure that I've maybe scheduled a pre-meeting where everybody has access to Zoom, or I'm sure participants can access it. If there's a virtual whiteboarding tool, we set up a pre-session where we become familiar with the tool ahead of time, so that the first time they're using a new technology is not when I actually need to engage in a facilitated activity or dialogue.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And I know you do some of those same, you do some other things before the session, right? To get people ready to engage. It's not just about, it's partly about getting over the technology hurdle, but tell us a little bit about what else you do before the session to get people ready.
Yeah, I really like how I think Laura said, it's really about thinking through the points of engagement and building trust from that very first communication. Carrie, you mentioned strategically thinking about pre-work. And in addition to, the technical hurdles and having perhaps an IT support function, as facilitator, it's also your job to make sure that when participants arrive, they have the content knowledge necessary. Perhaps if you're engaging in an ideation session, they understand the strategic pillars of your business's innovation strategy that are going to form the foundation for the starting point for the things that you're going to do. So there's that whole category of technical readiness, but then there's another category of content readiness that you have to think through as facilitator and say, how can I ensure that the people are ready from a content perspective, especially in this new environment where we all have lots of different constraints in our personal lives, different demands on our time. We have to make the pre-work bite-sized or perhaps modular, or in some way more accessible to ensure that participants are ready technically and mentally when they show up to participate.
Great. Good. I'm taking a look over. I've been jotting down some of the other questions that I've seen in the chat. One of the things that's come up a couple different times is when it works to act as a lone facilitator by yourself, and when maybe you need some support, you need a second or a third facilitator, or you need a moderator on the technology side. Laura, I wonder if you would share with us kind of how you think about that. When do you go it alone, and when do you make sure you have a support?
Sure. So a couple of things there. I think our standard on our team is that we always co-facilitate. So there's always 2 people from my team on every engagement, unless it's a very small, under 10-person engagement, because we tend to utilize things like breakouts and other creative tools, and it's really tough for a facilitator to be presenting and also be in the background trying to create breakout rooms and get the whiteboard ready to go with all the right palettes up and running. And so we take turns. So when one person's doing the presentation, the other person's doing the background work, and then we'll switch and flip and flop. It also is really nice because, frankly, all of us have lives beyond this work. And if someone ends up getting sick or has a sick kid and can't be there, at the very least, you still have one facilitator, right? So that's a standard for us. And we also notice that it's far easier to help breed trust, and I'll go back to this. Right, trust is temporal. It takes time and it takes engagement. And the best way to breed engagement is to engage. And so as we're in breakouts and smaller convening spaces, if there's 100 people and we've got 5 people in a breakout, those 5 people can build trust, right? And as facilitators, if there's 2 of us, we can pop in and out of those breakout rooms to check in, see how things are going, help smooth conversations along. And it's not that easy to do if there's just one of you popping in and out of those spaces or managing the chat while also the other person's managing the facilitation. So that's a standard for us to have at least 2 people. We don't tend to have a technology support person, but we've just gotten really adept at utilizing the technology and getting really confident with the technology, which, man, COVID-19 has created a lot of space for us. I feel like the whole team's like, we can do Zoom. So get really comfortable with the Zooms or the Murals or the Miros or all those collaboration tools. And I think less is better. So get 2 or 3 tools under your belt with high confidence, and you'll feel much better being able to manage that for yourself, in my view.
Great.
Yeah, I would second that. And I really like Marianne's comment in the chat where she says one of the advantages of having a second facilitator is if there's technical difficulties of a participant, you can drop that second facilitator and the participant into a separate breakout room to solve those challenges and then come back to the main room. We do that as well, and it can be really effective at not derailing the larger session.
Great. So I see we're getting a few questions about kind of apps or particular tools or formats to use, especially for sessions where there's brainstorming and then prioritizing of ideas. Jim, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of your favorite tools and formats, and how it changes when you have a small group of, say, 4 or 5 up to, if you have a big group of 20 or 30, what you do differently.
Yeah, so in the virtual environment, anytime I have more than 4 or 5 people that I'm facilitating as a group, we're probably going to break out into smaller groups. There's something about 4 or 5 which seems to be a limit in the virtual space for a conversation. Even 6 or 7 or 8, it's harder to have that intimate conversation or do that brainstorming and that sharing. The time kind of multiplies. So getting back to the idea of what tools, I'm not sure the tools necessarily vary that much, whether I'm working with 4 or 5 or 20 or 30, because ultimately I'm going to break those 20 or 30 down into groups of 4 or 5 anyway. Rather than stick and say, here's the tool you need to use, I like to think about the functionality I need the tool to have. So do I need simultaneous participation by multiple participants? And there's different platforms that do that, whether that's an online whiteboard platform like Mural, where we can all go add Post-its, or even something like a Google Doc, where we can all be logged in and contributing in some format at the same time. when it comes to that really helps with the divergent aspect of idea generation. When you get to that prioritization phase, a lot of times in rooms, facilitators will use like dot voting, like stickers, or pick your top 3 and move them to another physical location. Some of the platforms like Mural can replicate those features very easily in a digital environment. If you don't have access to those tools and you're using something free like Google Docs, you may have to get a little bit creative about highlight or put a star next to, type in. But there's different ways to accomplish that functionality of divergent and sharing and co-creating, and then prioritization and down selecting. But the key is, do I need simultaneous participation in a shared platform, or can I do it all without that?
Great. Good.
I see a couple questions about specific tools, so I'll name a couple of them that I like. Mural is probably one of my favorites, but the equivalents are things like Miro or Stormboard. Those are really effective tools for that virtual whiteboarding space. They also, a lot of them have templates that you can pre-populate, whether it's a business model canvas or a value proposition canvas, tools that'll feel very familiar to innovators, translated into the virtual environment.
Great. And Laura, I wonder if we might just sort of step back out of the tactical for a little bit as we kind of come towards wrapping up things here. And I wonder if you could help everybody think a little bit about what are the cultural changes that teams should expect to experience when they start to collaborate virtually, right? Well, like what things should people expect to be different here?
Yeah, so what we know about culture change is it's slow, and the more consistent we are and the more clear we are around the expectations, the better it'll go. It's sort of slow and then all at once. And what we notice is when we're setting expectations around, I expect everyone to share, I expect everyone to do the pre-work, and you acknowledge and thank people for doing that, that progress principle, that recognizing and acknowledging the progress people are making will enable their success. It'll help them keep doing the things that you notice and you appreciate. It's also really important that when we're in this virtual space that we don't fall into any bad habits or bad reps about letting the same old people share the same old things. And so really focusing in on that and making that a culture, a cultural norm. Well, if we do it, set the example, and I call it like drink our own champagne, like do the thing that you say you're going to do, follow through and follow up, then you're more likely to get that culture buzz to happen more quickly. What we also see as we go into more virtual land is that we've got to be really respectful of the fact that people are coming from different spaces and having different challenges, especially right now with COVID-19. Those of us who are parents are really struggling to figure out, how do I participate in this virtual thing that's requiring all of my attention? Well, I've got however many kids in the background, and the puppies, and the husbands and partners, all, maybe wrestling for attention, and creating some space of generosity and grace and setting that as a cultural norm is really important, especially if you want those folks to participate actively. If they feel like they're going to be excluded because it's too noisy or busy, then they're not likely to lean in, and you'll never get their participation, which means you'll also not get their collaboration or great ideas. So the culture process is be really clear. What's the culture that you want to set? Say it out loud, follow through on it, set those norms, and celebrate progress. And it'll get easier. It gets easier with time. Those are sort of my key takeaways for thinking about culture broadly.
Laura, those are awesome. I'll add a couple tactical ways to think about maybe implementing some of the things Laura just talked about. So one of the things that I find as a facilitator, it's always helpful. You're going to give the instructions verbally, but maybe there's a dog barking, or maybe somebody had to go run away to deal with their kid for a second. When they come back, if the directions are written somewhere as the activity is happening, it prevents you from having to constantly repeat for people who may have missed it. I also really like the idea of making sure as facilitator, you're managing people's attention and directing people's attention. In the room, that takes the form of maybe I'll walk over here and show you this thing on the wall, and then I'll walk over here and it'll direct your attention over here. Virtually, we all have just one screen. So what does directing attention really look like in the virtual environment? Well, maybe it means I shift between virtual sharing my screen when I want you to look at something on the screen, and then turn it off when I want you to pay attention to what I'm going to say. Or I keep a parking lot on the side of ideas where I say, you know what, that's a great conversation. We're going to move that over here into this virtual space so that you know that we're going to talk about it later. And then lastly, kind of the last comment on building trust I'll have is flex time. Just more time than you think you probably need for a virtual engagement. Number one, it allows you to have breaks that are not just, we have 3 minutes, everybody stand up, spin around and sit down, and we're going to keep going, but actual extended mental, physical breaks. It also allows you time for, if something's running long or taking more time, you don't feel crunched in different parts of the agenda. So my rule of thumb lately has been, 15 minutes plus of flex time for every hour of facilitation activity that I'm planning.
I will also just add one last tactical thing. It's something that's been a nice add for us is anytime we have a facilitation where we know we've got questions ahead of time, we've started creating like workbooks, so to speak. It's not a workbook that is meant necessarily for learning, but it has the questions in the PDF file so that the person can look at it on their screen or can print it and have it in front of them as they're working through the meeting, and also can take notes for themselves, and it creates a really nice artifact for that meeting, especially if there's follow through for it, right? It has the things, the expectations at the end, it has expectations at the beginning, sets the norms. And that's been a nice add, but again, it takes some pre-thought and some pre-work on the facilitator's perspective.
Excellent. Very good. Well, thank you both so much for your time today. Everybody who joined us as participants today, thank you for the engagement, for the questions. As Jeff said at the beginning, we are here for you. We're here to help. If there are ways that we can be of assistance to you, or if you need help thinking through how you're going to do something differently, feel free to reach out to me or to Jeff, and I can help make connections to the right folks on our team. So we hope that you all have a good rest of your afternoon and a good week. Stay safe, and hope to talk to you in the future. Bye-bye.